The Golden Horseshoe Bar was filled with its usual quiet hum, broken only by the low murmur of conversations. William, in his wheelchair, rolled inside, offering a gentle smile to the bartender, who nodded in return. Following him was his grandson, Derek, a tall, strong man with skin like polished ebony. Together, their presence seemed to command the room. Derek scanned the walls adorned with photographs and faded newspaper clippings. This place was a piece of his grandfather's past, but for him, it was simply a curious corner where old stories came alive. William pointed to a table in the corner, his favorite spot, and Derek helped him settle in. After ordering 2 glasses of soda, William began recounting tales of his youth. His eyes lit up, and his voice carried a warmth that made the stories feel vivid. Derek leaned forward, listening intently, respecting every word. But the peace didn't last. The bar door slammed open, and 4 men entered with a burst of loud voices and crude laughter. Leading the group was Brendan, a stocky man with short blonde hair and a commanding presence. Their eyes quickly landed on William and Derek. One of the men leaned toward Brendan, whispering something that drew laughter from the group. William continued speaking, but his tone became more restrained. He knew such groups rarely meant well. A few minutes later, one of the men deliberately approached their table. As he passed, he bumped William's wheelchair, spilling beer onto his lap. "Oops, sorry," he said, his tone dripping with mockery. Derek stood up. His eyes were calm, but his resolve was unmistakable. The man stepped back, smirking, his movements slow as if waiting for an attack. At that moment, Brendan rose from his seat and strode over. "No place for strangers here," Brendan announced loudly, his gaze sweeping across the room. Several patrons froze, while the bartender averted his eyes. Derek leaned forward slowly, closing the gap between them. His voice was steady, but every word carried weight. "Apologize." The seconds stretched like hours. One of Brendan's men grabbed Derek's shoulder, but in the next instant he was on the floor. Derek's movements were swift, precise, like a trained professional. Brendan took a step back, fury flaring in his eyes. Meanwhile, one of his men pulled out a phone, recording the scene. The camera caught only fragments of the conflict, cutting out the provocations and framing Derek as the aggressor. This video would become their weapon against him. When the tension settled, William said quietly, "You know they won't let this go." The morning after the bar incident began with an unsettling silence. William sat by the window, watching the sunlight slowly filter through the curtains. He couldn't shake the thought of how quickly an innocent evening had escalated into open confrontation. Derek entered the room, moving quietly through the house. His steps were steady, but his restrained anger was palpable. He was confident he had done the right thing by defending his grandfather, but he couldn't predict how far their opponents would go. A knock at the door interrupted the quiet. Derek opened it to find Martha, the owner of the Golden Horseshoe Bar, standing on the porch. Her face was tense, and she clutched an envelope in her hands. She stepped inside, glancing over her shoulder as if afraid someone might be watching. Martha explained that she had received threats the night before. She found a note warning her that if she cooperated with the police or provided any security footage, her business would suffer. She handed the envelope to William. Inside were photographs of him and Derek taken at the bar. It was a clear warning. William's brow furrowed. He understood that Brendan was using intimidation as a weapon to isolate them from potential allies. He assured Martha that she had done the right thing by coming to them, but it was now clear they were facing a dangerous opponent. Meanwhile, the police received a formal complaint from Brendan and his group. The video taken at the bar was submitted as evidence, painting Derek as the aggressor. William learned of this from an old acquaintance, Detective Wallace, who informed him that the case had been officially opened. Martha revealed that the bar's surveillance cameras had stopped working days earlier, but she suspected someone had deliberately sabotaged them. This news heightened their suspicions that Brendan would go to any lengths to hide the truth. William felt more vulnerable than ever. Despite his wisdom and experience, he knew one wrong move could endanger not only their lives but also the lives of those who supported them. Derek, on the other hand, was filled with determination. He went back to the bar to inspect the area himself and look for clues. But Brendan and his men were already making moves. Several neighbors reported seeing suspicious individuals near Martha's home, adding to the tension. That night, both William and Derek knew the fight was only beginning. William wrote a letter to an old friend at the local newspaper to draw attention to their plight. Meanwhile, Derek, on his way home, couldn't shake the feeling that someone was following him. William sat in his living room, reflecting on the morning's conversation with Martha. He could feel the web of threats tightening around their lives. Years of experience had taught him to read situations, and this one felt worse than most. He knew Brendan wouldn't let them go easily. Meanwhile, Derek spent the day on the streets, observing Brendan's men. He moved discreetly, using his build and ability to avoid drawing unnecessary attention. Rumors of extortion in the neighborhood were confirmed. Several shop owners spoke in hushed tones about being forced to pay for protection. But no one dared to speak openly about it. Derek returned home. He briefly shared his observations with William, mentioning that he had noticed several unfamiliar vehicles near a warehouse on the eastern edge of town. That warehouse had long been a source of suspicion among locals, but no one knew exactly what was happening there. William sighed. He understood the need for caution. They couldn't risk a direct confrontation without evidence. His experience told him that any wrong move could lead to catastrophic consequences. They met with Detective Wallace. William passed along the information Derek had gathered. The detective listened carefully, but his expression remained tense. He explained that without concrete evidence, the police couldn't launch an investigation. William knew they would have to find a way to obtain the necessary proof themselves. The day unfolded with growing tension. Martha reported that someone had visited her bar again. These individuals made no effort to hide their affiliation with the gang. They openly hinted that if Sheets cooperated with outsiders, her business would suffer. William felt the danger mounting. He reached out to a few old contacts who might be able to help. One of them was a former journalist who knew how to spread information without drawing attention to himself. Together, they began piecing together small bits of evidence to expose Brendan's activities. Derek returned to the warehouse. He decided to study it more closely but kept his distance to avoid being spotted. He observed people coming and going, carrying heavy crates. It looked like a hidden operation. At home, William sat with a notebook, jotting down every detail they had gathered. Every small fact could prove useful. He knew they would soon have to make a critical decision, to continue the fight or let things be. Neither of them slept well. They could feel the tension rising and knew that every move they made was being watched. But in their hearts, the determination to fight on burned brightly. At dawn, the town was wrapped in a light fog, as if veiling the growing tension. William gazed out the window, watching the rare passers-by hurrying along their way. His mind was occupied with the events of the past few days. Derek, returning from another observation of the warehouse, walked past him silently, lost in thought. They ate breakfast in silence. Derek seemed deep in contemplation, clearly weighing his next move. William sighed as he noticed the focused look in his grandson's eyes. Derek was determined, but sometimes his resolve bordered on overconfidence. William knew their adversary was a dangerous man who wouldn't hesitate to use threats or violence. After breakfast, William stepped outside to get some fresh air. Their neighbor, Mr. Harris, approached him, a kind-faced elderly man. Harris mentioned seeing unfamiliar cars repeatedly stopping near Martha's bar. He expressed concern, understanding that Brendan's gang might pose a threat to the entire neighborhood. This news put William on edge. He felt the pressure mounting and their time running out. After speaking with Harris, he returned inside and began drafting a letter to an old friend at the newspaper. He described the situation in detail, hoping public attention would bring more allies to their side. Meanwhile, Derek decided to return to the warehouse. He had a strong sense that something important could be uncovered there, shedding light on the gang's crimes. This time, he observed the area more closely. He noticed one of Brendan's men talking to a well-dressed man and handing him an envelope. Derek knew every detail could be crucial. He began taking photos with his phone, careful not to draw attention to himself. When he got home, he showed the pictures to William. One of them clearly captured the faces of several men locals had previously mentioned in stories about extortion. William studied the photographs intently, saying nothing. His silence spoke volumes. Finally, he remarked that they needed to meet with Detective Wallace as soon as possible. The next day, they visited the precinct. Wallace received them, though his expression remained tense. He acknowledged that the photographs could be valuable evidence, but without formal complaints from victims, their options were limited. William tried to persuade him that people were too scared to speak out openly, but Wallace only nodded, making no promises. When they returned home, an unpleasant surprise awaited them. A note was pinned to their door with a warning: "Stop before it's too late." Derek ripped it down and tossed it in the trash, but William stopped him. "Every detail matters," he said. They knew Brendan's gang was escalating its tactics. Yet despite the danger, their resolve only grew stronger. The night brought rain, drumming against roofs and windows, adding a foreboding backdrop to the unfolding events. Derek sat in the kitchen, reviewing the photographs he had taken at the warehouse. Thoughts of how each step they took grew more dangerous flickered through his mind. He knew Brendan wouldn't stop at threats, and now direct attacks were a real possibility. William entered the kitchen, his hands gripping the wheels of his wheelchair tightly. Despite his fatigue, his gaze was firm. He asked Derek if he had found anything new. Derek replied curtly that while they had evidence, it wasn't yet enough to convince the police to take action. Suddenly, the phone rang. It was Martha. Her voice trembled as she explained that her car had been vandalized with paint, and threats had been scrawled on the bar's walls. She could no longer remain silent and was asking for help. William and Derek left immediately. The rain intensified as they crossed the dark streets. The bar looked abandoned, the windows were shattered, and the doors were locked. Martha met them at the back entrance, her face pale and a flashlight in her hand. She led them inside, showing the aftermath of the vandalism. The walls were defaced, and debris littered the floor. Martha explained that a group of men had come by the previous evening, threatening her and demanding that she close the bar. She didn't argue but knew things couldn't go on like this. Derek examined the premises closely. On one wall, he noticed strange scratches, as if someone had tried to pry something open. It occurred to him that the gang might have been searching for security footage or other evidence that could incriminate them. After assessing the damage, William suggested Martha temporarily close the bar and stay with them for her safety. She agreed, though it was clear she struggled with accepting such help. Meanwhile, the gang intensified its pressure. Several neighbors told William they had seen suspicious people near their home. This heightened their anxiety but also confirmed they were on the right track. The next day, Derek went out for reconnaissance. He observed the warehouse again, noting an increase in the flow of people and trucks. It looked like preparations for something big were underway. Derek suspected the warehouse wasn't just a base but the central hub of Brendan's operations. When he returned home, he discussed his findings with William. They decided to gather more evidence to draw police attention and protect their neighbors. William proposed organizing a meeting with local residents to discuss how they could resist the gang. Several people gathered in William's yard. They were shop owners, neighbors, and concerned residents. Speaking from his wheelchair, William's voice was steady. "If we remain silent, they will destroy us one by one. Only together can we stop them." William's words inspired the group. Some offered to monitor the gang's movements and document any actions. Others promised to maintain contact with the police. The atmosphere was tense but united by a common goal. Derek couldn't sleep, knowing greater challenges lay ahead. But within him burned the determination to continue the fight. The morning began with a heavy realization: nothing had changed overnight. William and Derek, without speaking, woke up earlier than usual, as if an internal clock was urging them into action. Their home felt like a temporary fortress, and every step outside was a small battle. They knew it was time to act. Derek brought the laptop and connected the flash drive Martha had found. Footage began to play on the screen. The first video showed one of Brendan's men threatening a young bar patron, demanding payment for protection. The second displayed envelopes being exchanged, with Brendan himself giving orders. His voice was clear on the recording: "If they don't pay, that's their problem. They should know this is our neighborhood." The words sounded like a confession. William watched the screen intently, his hands gripping the armrests of his wheelchair. This footage is key. But it might not be enough to launch an investigation, he finally said. At the station, Detective Wallace greeted them without pleasantries. His expression was as grim as always, and he only nodded when he saw the flash drive. Watching the footage took nearly an hour, during which Wallace remained silent. His silence spoke louder than any words. When the last video ended, he leaned back in his chair. This is strong material. But to secure a warrant, I'll need more, something that confirms Brendan's connections to other districts or proves his involvement in major deals, he said. William sighed. We'll keep looking, he replied. Back home, Derek decided to revisit the warehouse, which they believed to be the operation's central hub. He spent hours observing and noticed a truck loaded with crates heading toward the southern part of the city. Voices caught his attention. Two men near the back entrance were discussing how the shipment needs to leave by morning. Martha knocked on their door. She reported seeing Brendan's men outside her bar, loudly talking about how it'll all be over early tomorrow. Her voice trembled, but she appeared determined. Derek immediately decided to check on the bar. At the bar, he saw several men standing near the entrance. They laughed loudly, making no effort to hide. Derek recorded their conversation. One of them spoke about an upcoming major deal, stressing the need to act quickly. After the men left, he checked the bar to ensure Martha's safety. On his way home, Derek realized he was being followed. A dark gray car trailed him slowly through the streets, but by turning into an alley he managed to lose it. At his door, he found a note waiting for him. You've gone too far. When William heard about it, he was silent for a long time before saying, They're scared of us. That means we're on the right path. William had organized a meeting to discuss how they could protect themselves and their homes. Slowly, about 30 people showed up in the backyard, some out of curiosity, others with a glimmer of hope. Many looked worried, but there was a spark of determination in their eyes. We all know who these people are, William began, seated in his wheelchair. His voice was calm but firm. And we all know how long they've kept us in fear. But staying silent only strengthens their power. Today we can change that. Some neighbors nodded in agreement, but uncertainty was evident on others' faces. An older resident, Mr. Jenkins, raised his hand. They'll retaliate, he said. We'll only make things worse. William held his gaze for a moment before responding. If we let fear control us, they've already won. We cannot remain silent. William's words inspired many. People began suggesting ideas, organizing night patrols, documenting suspicious activity, and supporting one another. Martha proposed creating a shared log of all observations to pass along to Detective Wallace. After the meeting, Derek decided to check the warehouse again. He knew it could hold the key to everything. Sneaking through empty streets, he spotted the same truck he'd seen before. It was parked on the loading dock, with two men walking around it. One of them said loudly, Everything needs to be delivered by tomorrow, no delays. Derek pulled out his phone and began recording their conversation. This could be another crucial piece of evidence against the gang. He decided not to linger and returned home to share his findings with William. Martha reported seeing Brendan's men near her bar again. This time, there were 3 of them acting more brazenly than before, laughing loudly, threatening patrons, and even scrawling threatening graffiti on the wall. Derek immediately headed there. From a distance, he observed their behavior, recording every move. One of the men said, Tomorrow, the deal goes down, and we're done with this neighborhood. This confirmed Derek's suspicion that the gang was trying to wrap up their operations before their activities were fully exposed. He was certain the upcoming deal was tied to the truck he'd seen at the warehouse. Back home, he shared everything with William, who listened intently before saying, We need to get this to Detective Wallace, and fast. They had feared most finally happened. Brendan's men appeared on the streets, moving from house to house, throwing rocks at windows, scrawling threats on walls, and shouting loudly. One of them approached William's door and left a note that read, If you don't stop, this is just the beginning. Hearing the commotion, Derek rushed outside. He managed to scare off the vandals quickly, but he knew this was just a show of force. The gang wanted to prove they weren't afraid of confrontation. Despite the events, William remained calm, his resolve only growing stronger. "If they're scared enough to come here at night, then we're on the right track," he said. The next day, the article was published. It spread throughout the neighborhood, sparking a wave of discussions. People read about the gang's crimes, including extortion, threats, and assaults. The story included footage from the flash drive, clearly showing Brendan's involvement. Several of Brendan's men showed up at Martha's bar, threatening her and the patrons. But this time, Martha was prepared. She called the neighbors, and within minutes, a group arrived to confront the gang. Together, they managed to drive the men away, proving that the neighborhood was beginning to fight back. But William knew this was just the beginning. Greater challenges lay ahead, and the next night could very well be decisive. The publication of the article detailing Brendan's gang had stirred the neighborhood. People read the paper, shared the news, but kept their voices low, as if afraid to speak too loudly. The streets, which had been quiet the day before, were now filled with tension. William sat at the table, reviewing the growing list of neighborhood observations. Martha had organized a log where residents could report suspicious activity, sightings of Brendan's men, unusual vehicles near the warehouse, or strangers loitering by the bar. The data could be critical, but it needed to be organized. Derek, seated nearby, flipped through notebooks, sorting the most significant entries. At the same time, trouble was brewing at Martha's bar. She noticed a group of men, clearly connected to Brendan, lingering by the entrance. They appeared to be discussing something, occasionally glancing toward the doors. She quickly messaged Derek, who decided to check things out. The bar itself seemed calm, but the tension outside was unmistakable. Derek parked a short distance away and began observing without drawing attention. The men acted brazenly, talking loudly and making exaggerated gestures, but they didn't enter. Derek started recording their behavior, careful not to be noticed. Elsewhere in the neighborhood, small acts of vandalism were increasing. Threatening graffiti appeared on walls, and trash bags were scattered in some yards. It was an attempt to remind everyone that the gang still controlled the area. William received updates from neighbors, noting that fear was beginning to creep back in. The resolve people had shown after the article was starting to waver. When Derek returned, he brought new footage. William and Martha reviewed it carefully. The men outside the bar were the same individuals Martha had seen before. It was clear they weren't going to leave quietly. Later in the evening, news came in. The truck Derek had seen at the warehouse had finally moved. Neighbors spotted it on a street heading toward the city's outskirts. It could be connected to the deal Derek had overheard, so he decided to follow it. Keeping a safe distance, Derek tailed the truck as it traveled down a deserted highway toward an abandoned industrial area. The truck stopped at one of the buildings, and several men got out to unload crates. Their movements were quick and deliberate, as if they were racing against time. One man, who appeared to be in charge, barked orders at the others. Derek continued recording from a hidden spot. On the video, one of the crates slipped and fell to the ground, spilling small packages. A nearby man quickly scooped them up and returned them to the crate. Derek couldn't identify what the packages contained, but his instincts told him it was significant. Back at home, he handed the footage to William, who meticulously analyzed every frame. Their suspicions were confirmed. The warehouse was indeed a hub for storing and distributing contraband. The next step was to deliver this evidence to Detective Wallace. A rock was thrown through William's ground floor window, shattering the glass. Attached to the rock was a note, "Final warning." It was a clear sign that the gang was prepared to escalate. William refused to let fear take hold. He gathered the neighbors and shared the latest events. This was a turning point. They would either unite and continue their fight, or allow the gang to regain control. William's words inspired the group, and they agreed to strengthen night patrols to prevent further attacks. The next day, they sent the new evidence to Detective Wallace, who promised to expedite the process of securing an arrest warrant. But William knew everything hinged on the coming night. If the gang didn't back down, a confrontation was inevitable. Neighbors who had agreed to join the patrols gathered at William's house to finalize plans. The atmosphere was tense but calm. People avoided speaking too loudly, as though every word might draw the gang's attention. Derek coordinated routes and explained how to document suspicious activities. William observed the preparations from his window, feeling a mix of pride and anxiety. Seeing the community come together was a victory in itself, but the threats from the gang loomed large. The note left the previous night was a stark reminder of the danger they faced, and he couldn't shake the thought that Brendan's men were planning something bigger. Patrols moved along their designated routes, noting anything unusual. Some neighbors drove slowly through the streets, keeping watch from their cars. It created an illusion of security, but everyone knew the calm wouldn't last. Around midnight, a dull crash echoed through a nearby yard. Derek, patrolling a neighboring street, hurried to the scene. He found a broken window in an older woman's house. Shaking with fear, she pointed toward the alley, saying she had seen two men running away but couldn't identify them. Inspecting the scene, Derek found a rock among the shards of glass. A note was attached to it, reading, "The next hit will be worse." It was a clear attempt at intimidation, but instead of fear, it sparked determination among those who had chosen to fight back. When Derek returned to William's house, the neighbors were already discussing the incident. People voiced their fears, but the unity among them grew stronger. For the first time in years, the community began to feel like a cohesive force, ready to stand against their oppressors. Derek and William prepared to deliver new evidence to Detective Wallace. Among the materials were photographs of the trucks at the warehouse, videos showing the dropped crates, and neighbors' reports of suspicious activities. All of it strengthened their case. Wallace received them with his usual stoic demeanor. He examined the materials carefully, flipping through the photos and pausing at key frames in the video. His expression remained unreadable, but his focus suggested the gravity of the situation. "These will help expedite the process," he finally said. Before William could respond, another officer entered the room, reporting an incident at Martha's bar. Derek rushed to the scene. When he arrived, he saw the aftermath of a confrontation. Several men associated with Brendan's gang had tried to intimidate patrons, but the locals, standing together, managed to drive them away. It was a small but significant victory. William proposed another meeting with the neighbors. He wanted to discuss how they could protect not only their homes but also public spaces. Ideas began to flow, increasing surveillance, installing cameras, and maintaining regular communication with the police. It was the first step toward building a united community. But the gang wasn't backing down. The following day, Derek received word that the warehouse where he had seen the trucks was now empty. All the crates had been moved. This suggested the gang had either completed their deal or was preparing for another move. Derek decided to investigate personally. He returned to the industrial zone and found the warehouse deserted. Tire tracks crisscrossed the floor, and broken crate fragments littered the corner. He photographed everything that could serve as evidence, but a gnawing sense of urgency told him the gang was moving to the next phase of their operation. Back at home, Derek noticed neighbors reinforcing their homes, metal bars over windows, stronger locks on doors. It symbolized a shift in the community's mindset. They were done living in fear. William reviewed their plans, his thoughts drifted to what lay ahead. The final confrontation with Brendan's gang felt inevitable, and he knew they had to be prepared for whatever came next. Tension gripped the neighborhood as the fight against Brendan's gang neared its climax. Despite recent victories, fear lingered in the hearts of residents. William sat in his room, reviewing the latest reports from neighbors. The evidence against the gang was overwhelming, but the ultimate goal was clear: Brendan and his men had to be stopped. Derek spent his day observing the warehouse again. His suspicions that it was the gang's primary base grew stronger after neighbors reported increased activity. Trucks arrived and departed, their contents concealed under heavy tarps. Derek meticulously documented everything, knowing these details could be critical. Meanwhile, William coordinated street patrols. Neighbors took turns keeping watch and reporting suspicious actions. The community's unity became a barrier against the gang, and even those hesitant at first began to join in. The neighborhood was no longer willing to submit to fear. Detective Wallace soon delivered the news they had been waiting for: the warrant had been approved. This marked their first significant breakthrough. The operation was set to begin immediately, and Derek was ready to provide all the information he had gathered. He handed over videos, photos of the trucks, and detailed observations of the warehouse. All evidence pointed to this location as the gang's operational hub. Police forces arrived without warning, surrounding the warehouse. Their strategy was precise, blocking every possible escape route. Inside, the gang members scrambled in chaos, trying to secure goods and documents. Derek observed from a hidden vantage point. The first police unit stormed the building, sparking a brief but intense shootout. Brendan, realizing his empire was collapsing, made a desperate escape. He broke through a rear exit and ran toward a nearby wooded area. Derek didn't hesitate and gave chase. Brendan seemed familiar with every corner of the neighborhood, but Derek, faster and more determined, gradually closed the distance. The chase led them to an old, decaying bridge that had been abandoned for years. Reaching the middle of the bridge, Brendan stopped, his breathing ragged. He turned to see Derek closing in. The structure beneath them groaned under their weight, threatening to collapse. Brendan tried to move further, but he stumbled and fell. Derek lunged forward, extending a hand to stop him from falling. "Hold on," Derek shouted, gripping Brendan's fingers tightly. But the gang leader couldn't secure his hold. The bridge gave way, and Brendan plummeted into the darkness below. A sudden, eerie silence filled the air as his figure disappeared into the shadows. Returning to the warehouse, Derek found the police wrapping up their operation. Most of the gang members had been arrested, and the trucks were filled with contraband, undeniable proof of their criminal activities. The next day, the neighborhood felt a sense of relief for the first time in years. Residents gathered at Martha's Bar, the place that had once symbolized fear but now represented unity. Laughter and conversations filled the air as people discussed their plans for the future. William sat quietly in the corner, observing the scene. It was hard to believe that the seemingly hopeless fight had ended in victory. But he knew the real work was just beginning. Rebuilding the community's trust and teaching people not to live in fear would take time. Martha approached him with a cup of coffee and said, "None of this would have been possible without you." William smiled, though his eyes betrayed his exhaustion. He knew the fight against crime was never truly over, but for now, this moment was theirs to savor, a small, hard-earned victory.